What does it mean when we talk about economics and migration? What is the labor market? How does the labor market contribute to the overall economy, and what role do immigrants play in all that? And a pattern which we see in many countries is that immigrants are strongly concentrated at the low end of the labor market, low end of the educational or of the occupational distribution, and then we find them also at the upper end. You may be a trained surgeon, but if you don't speak English, you only get a job as a nurse, if at all. So it takes some time for you to accumulate knowledge and learning in order to become productive in the UK economy according to your previous qualification. So we call it downgrading. Immigrants downgrade. They work in jobs which are below their observed qualification. Now, I told you earlier, immigrants upgrade. So they learn the language, they learn how things work in the UK. So that means in the beginning they may earn low wages, but their wage situation is improving. Do immigrants pay more in terms of taxes than they take out in benefits, or do they pay less in terms of taxes than they take out in benefits? Now, I came to this country fully educated. I had a PhD, I had a high school degree, I had a primary degree, etc. So somebody has paid for it. I'm working here now for 22 years. So that means all my productive life I spent in this country. But my education was paid by my country. Those workers who come from other European countries to work in the UK have actually made a substantial financial contribution by paying more in terms of taxes than what they take out in terms of benefits.
For the Remain side of the campaign, clearly accepting EU free movement means a certain loss of control. If we weren't in the EU, or the EU didn't exist for whatever reason, a parallel universe, we probably wouldn't devise an immigration policy like the one we have now.
People always say, oh, freedom of movement is essential, isn't it? It's always been, it's been there since 1957. It's one of the kind of founding principles of the European Union. Well, yes and no, it has been there since 1957. As I said, until 2004, it was used hardly at all. Some of these changes in the late 80s, early 90s have made it essentially that you could move from one country to another and be treated, if you were coming here, as a British citizen more or less from day one, which is required by the principle of non-discrimination, which effectively makes it illegal to favour your own national citizens. This is not a principle that is supported by very many people across Europe. It didn't matter in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s because nobody really took advantage of it. And come 2004, it happened on a very, very large scale.
But I think it's also important to see this in the wider context. The UK is nominally in control of non-EU migration, and as Christian outlined, we've been experiencing far higher numbers of non-EU migration historically than EU migration. So meeting the net migration target would always be a huge challenge. In my view, I think it looks pretty much impossible to meet due to several factors that are always going to be out of a government's control.
In general about immigration, I think sort of looking a bit more widely about what is the experience of other countries. The UK is not unique in being a developed country experiencing high levels of migration. In a globalised world, migration tends to come with free trade and globalisation.
The Leave side of the debate also has to answer questions because there clearly are economic considerations if you're talking about radically reducing the labour supply, which some people seem to want on the Leave side. We should also remember that some people on the Leave side argue that we need to leave the EU so we can have an immigration policy which actually allows us to have more non-EU migration and less EU migration.
We need more facts in that debate. We need to understand very clearly what type of migration we have been drawing from Europe. We need to strengthen the case for the economic aspects of that particular migration and how the EU, as well as Britain, is benefiting from that.
It is just a matter of time before freedom of movement will be revised again. Some states might like to keep it like that. I think there are now a lot of states that do not want to have absolute freedom of movement. They want to have qualified freedom of movement, which is what we used to have. Some of the countries that have been most in favour of non-discrimination for their own citizens. The Poles and the Hungarians have been very much in favour of allowing their citizens to come to Britain and do what the hell they like, and be treated as a British citizen in effect. Suddenly they are discovering they are on what they regard as the wrong end of big inflows from points east, and they don't like it.
So we have a mix-up of free mobility of movement within the European Union, to which, of course, the UK is part. But this is mixed up with the refugee debate at the moment, which has very little to do with free movement.
Migration is going to play a huge part in the referendum campaign. It's one of the biggest issues that people cite as big issues facing the country politically. And I think it's a difficult issue for both sides.